Our scripture reading for today is from the 14th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. It is a story that follows immediately on the heels of the feeding of the 5,000. Listen for what the Spirit would speak to us through these words. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come onto the water to you." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Even in an age of biblical illiteracy, many people know the story of Jesus walking on the water. It is a well-worn metaphor. The part about Peter walking on the water may be less well known, but I heard this story enough times growing up in the church that it's familiar to me, and perhaps to many of you as well. If you are familiar with the story, what are your thoughts on Peter? How does he function in this story? Is he a heroic figure? An example to follow? Or is he a vivid illustration of the disciples' regular failure to get it? Their struggles with faith? I'm not sure if I came to this on my own or if I picked it up along the way from sermons and Sunday school. But I've long had the notion that Peter is a cautionary tale, a failure, the one you don't want to be, soaking wet with Jesus wagging a finger at you, "You of little faith." I mentioned in my sermon last Sunday about how my father would read Bible stories to us as children. These gave me a familiarity, knowledge of many of the major stories of the Bible, but it also oversimplified them, making them a bit like comic books. And that notion of Scripture followed me well into adulthood. I tended to view the Bible as a simple, even crude, collection of stories with obvious meanings. Such notions were only supported by the popular view of Scripture as a straightforward account of what happened. It never occurred to me that much of the Bible was written by sophisticated theological thinkers who told carefully nuanced stories filled with symbolism and multiple layers of meaning. In my comic book understanding of Scripture, our gospel reading is just one more miracle story, another fantastical account of the unbelievable things that Jesus can do. The disciples are there just to provide terrified, all-filled witnesses. And Peter, well, Peter's tendency to speak first and think later is always getting him into trouble, and here he goes again. I'm not sure, maybe it was seminary when I finally started to recognize Scripture for the well-written literature, the great literature that it actually is. I don't know, maybe I was a little slower than most to give up my childish understandings of Scripture. But I've known many intelligent, well-educated, enlightened adults who regard Scripture with a certain disdain as a primitive, unsophisticated collection of stories and tales. With all that in mind, let's take a look at our story. But before we do, we need to recall that story that precedes it. Jesus has just fed the 5,000. That's 5,000 men, not counting all the women and children. In this story, the disciples, the meager resources of the disciples, who almost always symbolize the church in Matthew's gospel, provide more than enough to feed thousands of hungry people, with an abundance left over to spare. Having demonstrated to the disciples how much they can accomplish no matter how sparse the resources, Jesus sends them out in the boat on their own. The very first Christians adopted the boat as a symbol of the church. So perhaps we could say that Jesus, having shown the church all that they can do with Jesus' help, sends them out onto the water, sends them out into a dangerous world. For the writer of Matthew's gospel and for the congregation of Jewish Christians to whom he writes, all of them Jews, the sea almost always had negative connotations. Israel was never a seafaring people. In their creation story, God's good world is drawn out of a formless, watery void, pre-creation chaos. And in the Noah story, another sophisticated, often misunderstood theological reflection, the question of whether God might let a wayward world simply sink back into watery chaos is asked and answered. And so in our story, the disciples, the church, perhaps, are sent out into a dangerous world, a troubled world where anti-creation forces are at work. And as the boat is out on the waters, battered by waves, tossed about, Jesus comes to them. In the story here, the disciples seem to almost cease to be people, and they become a little like a chorus in a Greek play, operating in complete unison. They were terrified. They say it is a ghost. They cry out in fear. But then Jesus speaks into the chaos. And the scene shifts dramatically. The Greek chorus vanishes, reappearing again at the end of the story. And only Jesus and Peter remain. Peter, another symbolic figure. Lord, if it is you, call me, command me to come to you on the water. There goes Peter again, shooting off his mouth without thinking, as he so often does. But Jesus does not chastise him, does not correct him, as we would expect if Peter's out of line. No, Jesus does exactly as Peter asked. And this disciple steps out of the boat, out of the safe confines of the church, and onto the water with Jesus. In the story, Peter takes a great risk. He makes an amazing effort because Jesus calls to him. And I think that sometimes we move so quickly to what happens next in the story, we don't notice what a remarkable feat this is. Peter walking on the water, just as Jesus does. Peter stepping out on faith, taking a huge risk. But before too long, the dangers all around get the better of Peter, as surely they would most anyone. And he cries out, perhaps recalling the psalm, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. Do not let the flood sweep over me, or the deep swallow me up." And Jesus quickly extends a hand and lifts Peter up. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" In my image of that scene, Jesus is smiling. He's not chastising Peter. He's encouraging him for the next time. What if Peter never had stepped out of the boat, never left the safety of the church? He would never have known the feeling of walking on the water, even amidst the anti-creation chaos forces that seek to undermine God's abundant world. He would never have discovered that when he slipped and fell, Jesus would lift him up. I wonder if this story isn't much more than an emphatic statement about how Jesus is more powerful than all the anti-creation chaos forces of greed, hate, racism, selfishness, despair, and more. I wonder if it is not also a call for us to be like Peter, to step out onto the waters, to leave the safety of the church, to join Jesus in ministry to a broken world. I wonder if Peter isn't the one we are supposed to emulate. Some years ago, Ernest Campbell, a Presbyterian minister who pastored Riverside Church in New York City from in the turbulent 60s, late 60s until the mid 70s, spoke at a faith gathering, a gathering of faith leaders, about the crisis in the church. That was a time when people's faith, their trust in institutions began to break down. Not surprisingly, the institutional church began a decline at that time that continues until this day. Campbell said, the reason we seem not to have faith in our time is that we are not doing anything that requires it. It takes faith to leave the safe confines of the church, to step out onto the troubled waters, the chaos in the world. It involves no small amount of risk, even more so when COVID-19 is raging and racial unrest boiling over in cities and towns large and small. It is tempting to batten down the hatches and to ride out the storm. But if our story is any guide, we only discover the amazing things Jesus empowers us to do and the certainty that he will lift us up should we fall when we have faith, when we take the risk and step out into the storm with Jesus. All praise and glory to the God who comes to us in Jesus and calls us, come, follow me wherever I go. Thanks be to God.